The train screeched to a halt at Harrison Ridge Station, and Lena Carter stepped off, her heart pounding, as she faced the unfamiliar town that would either welcome her with open arms or cast her back into the shadows of the city she had fled. She stepped off the platform, feeling the weight of the moment settle in her chest, mixed with equal parts hope and fear. For years she had lived in the shadows of the city, overlooked and unwanted. But today she was about to begin anew. Today she was going to find the one thing she had longed for: belonging. The letter had arrived on a cold winter morning, neatly folded the paper, smelling faintly of cedarwood and fresh ink. It was an invitation from Nathan Turner, a widowed farmer who, in a moment of vulnerability, had confessed his loneliness in a personal ad. His words had reached Lena's heart in a way that made her believe, maybe for the first time in a long time, that someone truly saw her. Not just the color of her skin, but the person she was inside. "I am a man seeking a woman of substance." The letter had said, "A woman with a past, a woman with hope's dreams, a woman who can see the world beyond its flaws. I would be honored to welcome you into my life." The invitation was simple. It spoke of possibility of a future built on mutual respect. Free from the burdens of her past, Lena had gathered all her savings, packed her life into a single trunk, and made the long journey to Harrison Ridge. She had pictured this moment 1,000 times in her mind, imagining the warmth of Nathan's greeting, the kindness in his eyes as they met for the first time. She had carefully chosen her attire for the meeting, a dress that had cost more than she could afford but felt necessary to mark this new chapter. It was delicate, elegant, just the right touch for a fresh start. But now, standing in the shadow of the old station building, Lena's heart sank. She could feel the cold stares of the townspeople, their eyes flicking to her with a mix of curiosity and judgment. She was a woman of color, alone in a place where her kind was rarely seen, let alone welcomed. A figure emerged from the crowd. Nathan Turner. Lena took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked towards him, the promise of a new beginning glimmering in her chest. But as their eyes met, everything she had imagined crumbled. Nathan froze. His smile faltered as his gaze swept over her, pausing at the rich, dark hue of her skin. For a moment, time seemed to slow, as if the entire station held its breath, waiting for what would happen next. You're not what I expected," Nathan muttered, his voice wavering. Lena felt her pulse quicken, but she held her ground. Her hands tightened around the handle of her trunk as she stepped closer. "I'm exactly what you invited," she said, her voice steady, though her insides trembled. Nathan looked around nervously, as if the eyes of the world were suddenly upon him. His face turned pale, and he took an involuntary step back. The bouquet of flowers he had been holding, meant to symbolize a warm welcome, drooped in his sweaty hands. I didn't know you were." His words faltered. "You didn't say in your letters, I didn't know you were black." Lena's heart dropped, but she refused to let him see her pain. "I didn't know I needed to," she replied coolly, her voice cutting through the thickening tension. "You never asked." The silence that followed was suffocating. Lena could feel the eyes of the townspeople, the murmurs rippling through the crowd. A black woman standing alone in the center of a sea of white faces. Nathan shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting around. "I'm sorry, I didn't expect this," he stammered, his voice now barely above a whisper. I can't do this. My community, my business. This won't work." Lena's chest tightened as the weight of his words sank in. He wasn't just rejecting her. He was rejecting everything she represented. Everything she had worked so hard to become. "You'll have to return," Nathan said, his words filled with the hollow pretense of kindness. "I'll pay for your ticket back. I'm sure you'll understand." Lena clenched her fists at her sides, the last remnants of her hope dissolving with every word he spoke. She looked him in the eye, her heart pounding, but her voice calm and resolute. "Understand what?" she asked. "That my skin is dark, or that my feelings are just as real as yours?" "You never asked, Mr. Turner." Just as Nathan opened his mouth to protest, a deep voice interrupted him, cutting through the tension like thunder on a clear day. "Is that your solution? Turner, throw money at the problem and hope it goes away?" Lena turned to see Julian Fairchild standing behind Nathan. He was tall, his posture commanding, Dressed in fine but understated clothes, Julian carried himself with an air of authority that immediately made Nathan shrink. His piercing eyes locked onto Nathan with an unspoken challenge. "This is none of your concern," Nathan muttered clearly, rattled. "It becomes my concern when I see a man I've known for years act like a coward." Julian replied, his voice unwavering. Julian turned to Lena, his gaze softening. "Miss Carter, allow me to introduce myself. I'm Julian Fairchild. I own land just outside of town. If you'd like, you can come with me. I'm sure I can offer you a place to stay until you decide your next course of action." Lena hesitated, unsure of this sudden offer, but seeing no other option, she nodded stiffly. "Thank you." Julian's offer was unexpected, but there was something about his presence, something about his conviction that made her believe he was a man who would not turn his back on her. As she followed him away from the station, her heart was heavy with the weight of everything that had just transpired. She had come to Harrison Ridge hoping for a new beginning, but all she had found was rejection. Yet in that rejection, there was an undeniable spark, a possibility that maybe this town held more than just prejudice. Maybe it could also be a place of transformation. Lena Carter's journey had just begun. Lena walked beside Julian Fairchild, her trunk rolling along behind her, each step taking her further from the station and the rejection she had just endured. The town of Harrison Ridge seemed unchanged, its quaint houses and busy storefronts still locked in time. But for Lena, everything felt different now. The promise of a new life, one that had seemed so close just moments ago, now felt like a distant dream. Julian didn't speak at first, allowing her the space to process what had happened. But Lena could feel his steady presence beside her, a quiet reassurance that somehow, against all odds, she was not truly alone. "I must apologize for the way you were treated," Julian finally said, his voice low and sincere. "That kind of behavior is shameful, and I regret that you had to experience it." Lena nodded, the sting of Nathan's rejection still fresh, but she could sense something different in Julian's words. They weren't empty. They were laced with genuine empathy. In the midst of all the prejudice and hurt she had faced, his kindness was a stark contrast. "I appreciate that," Lena replied, her voice steady. "But I've come this far, Julian. I'm not going to let one man's ignorance define my future." She felt her resolve strengthen with each word she spoke. Julian looked at her, his eyes thoughtful. "That's the spirit. You won't find much tolerance in this town, but I hope you'll find something more. You'll find a place where you can be yourself, where you can make a real difference." As they approached the edge of town, the roads grew quieter, the noise of Harrison Ridge fading into the background. Julian's estate was nestled on the outskirts, just beyond the town's borders, where the trees grew tall and the fields stretched out like green carpets. The manor loomed ahead, its grand silhouette standing against the horizon, a blend of old-world elegance and quiet power. It was a far cry from the humble cottages of the town, with tall, ornate gates and a sweeping driveway that curved toward the entrance. "This is Fairchild Manor," Julian said, his voice filled with pride. "It's been in my family for generations." Lena couldn't help but gaze at the towering stone walls, the ivy that clung to them like a living tapestry. There was something both intimidating and inviting about the place. It was nothing like the small, cramped apartments she had known in the city. This was a world of its own, one she wasn't sure she belonged to, but one that promised something better than the rejection she had faced. Julian led her to the front door, where it swung open before they even reached it. Mrs. Harper, the housekeeper, stood in the doorway, her face warm but formal. "Welcome, Miss Carter," she said, her voice calm but friendly. "I've prepared the guest room for you." Lena smiled politely, grateful for the warmth in Mrs. Harper's eyes. "Thank you," she replied, stepping into the grand foyer. The interior of the manor was just as impressive as the outside high ceilings, polished wood floors and walls lined with priceless paintings and old books. It was the kind of place that seemed to hold centuries of stories within its walls. "This way," Julian said, leading Lena up a sweeping staircase. "I hope you'll find comfort here. Miss Carter, you're welcome to stay as long as you need." They arrived at a large room at the end of the hall. The soft light of the afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows, casting a warm glow across the room. A large bed sat against one wall, its white linens neatly arranged, and a desk sat by the window, perfect for quiet reflection. It was peaceful, a place to unwind and start fresh. "Please make yourself at home," Julian said, his voice still gentle but with a sense of finality, as though he was giving her permission to truly settle in. "If you need anything, Mrs. Harper or I will be nearby." Lena stood in the middle of the room, taking it all in. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a sense of relief, as though the weight of the world had been lifted just a little bit. She could start over here. No one would judge her, at least not here. This was a place where she could find peace and maybe even purpose. As Julian left the room, closing the door behind him, Lena walked over to the window and gazed out at the sprawling grounds. It was a beautiful sight, and for a moment she allowed herself to imagine a life where this was her reality. A life free from rejection, free from the chains of prejudice. But there was something else, a deeper question that had been lingering in her mind since the moment she stepped off that train. What was Julian's real reason for offering her a place to stay? His kindness was unmistakable, but there was a depth to his generosity that she couldn't quite understand. She would have time to think about it later. For now, she needed to focus on herself to regain her strength. The world outside the manor could wait. Inside these walls, she would find the courage to build a future she could be proud of. The days that followed Lena's arrival at Fairchild Manor felt like a gentle unfolding. She spent her mornings in quiet contemplation, her afternoons exploring the sprawling grounds, and her evenings with Julian, who seemed to always have time to engage her in thoughtful conversation. But as much as she appreciated the peace and comfort the manor offered, there was an underlying tension she couldn't shake. Lena had never been one to settle for the status quo. She was driven by a sense of purpose, a belief that she could make a difference, not just in her own life, but in the world around her. And as she spent more time in the manor, she began to sense that there was something more to Julian Fairchild than he had initially let on. Despite his outward kindness, Julian was a man with deep convictions, convictions that had in some way shaped the way he had lived his life. She had noticed the way his expression darkened whenever he spoke about Harrison Ridge, the small town that had rejected him as much as it had embraced him. He was a man who, for all his wealth and power, remained an outsider in a place that clung to old, rigid values. Lena's curiosity grew as the days went by, especially when she discovered the large, well-stocked library tucked away in one corner of the manor. It wasn't just a place for books, it was a treasure trove of history, law, and knowledge. Books lined the shelves from floor to ceiling, their spines worn with age and use. There were maps, journals, and legal documents that covered a wide range of topics. It was in this room that Lena began to uncover the town's hidden secrets. One afternoon, while Julian was away, attending to business in Harrison Ridge, Lena found herself once again drawn to the library. She had been reading through a collection of old town records when a particular folder caught her eye. It was tucked away in the back of the room, its contents wrapped in old leather, as though it had been hidden from view. Her heart raced as she pulled it from the shelf, her fingers brushing the delicate edges of the worn leather. The folder contained a series of legal documents, land deeds and contracts that dated back more than 100 years. As she flipped through the pages, her eyes widened with disbelief. It was a series of records detailing the land disputes that had shaped Harrison Ridge. The names on the documents were familiar: Turner Fairchild and several other families who were the founding pillars of the town. But as she dug deeper, something caught her attention. An old deed signed by a governor in 1866. The deed granted land to Miles Carter, a freedman who had worked tirelessly for years to earn his freedom. Lena's great-grandfather, Miles Carter, had been promised land as a part of his emancipation land that he had never been able to claim due to the manipulation and dishonesty of the town's founding families. Lena's breath caught in her throat. The land she had grown up hearing about, the land that had been taken from her family, was right here in front of her, documented in black and white. The deed signed and sealed was proof that her great-grandfather had been wronged, that the land had been taken from him, and that the Turner and Fairchild families had been involved in the injustice. Her hands trembled as she carefully examined the documents. The realization hit her like a thunderclap. The foundation of Harrison Ridge, the wealth and power of its founding families, was built on a lie that had taken the land that was rightfully hers Lena felt the weight of the past come crashing down on her. But there was something else, something deeper stirring within her. This wasn't just about the land. This was about justice. She spent the rest of the afternoon meticulously going through the records, cross-referencing dates and names. She began to piece together a puzzle, one that would unravel the very fabric of the town's history. The more she uncovered, the more she realized that this wasn't just a personal journey. It was a mission. As the sun began to set, Julian returned to the manor. He found Lena sitting by the library table, a pile of documents in front of her, her brow furrowed in concentration. There was a quiet intensity about her, one he hadn't seen before. He hadn't realized how deeply the town's history had begun to affect her, how much she had already uncovered. "I see you found something interesting," Julian said, leaning against the doorway with a half smile. Lena looked up, her eyes meeting his. "I have," she replied, her voice steady, though there was an unmistakable fire in her words. "I've found the truth." Julian raised an eyebrow, intrigued but cautious. "The truth?" Lena stood up and walked over to the table, carefully pulling out the deed she had discovered. She placed it in front of him, her hands gripping the edges of the paper, as though she were presenting him with the key to something monumental. This deed, Lena began, her voice low but clear, was signed by a governor in 1806, granting land to my great-grandfather, Miles Carter. He was promised this land when he was freed, but instead it was stolen from him by the founding families of this town. Families like the Turners and the Fairchilds. Julian's eyes widened as he scanned the document, his face shifting from curiosity to disbelief. "You're saying that your great-grandfather owned land here, and that it was taken?" Lena nodded, her voice filled with quiet determination. "Yes, this land was meant to be his, but it was stolen through lies and manipulation, and the people who benefited from it are still here, still controlling everything." Julian's expression softened as he looked at Lena. He could see the fire in her eyes, the resolve that burned within her. This was no longer just about personal justice. It was about something much larger. He had known from the beginning that Lena was not a woman who would back down, but now he understood just how deep her resolve ran. "This changes everything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lena turned to face him, her eyes unwavering. "It does, and I intend to make it right." The discovery of the land deed was like a spark igniting a fire inside Lena. What had begun as a quiet curiosity now felt like a battle cry, a call to action that could no longer be ignored. Every page she had uncovered in the library had revealed a new layer of corruption, a deep-seated conspiracy that had allowed Harrison Ridge to thrive at the expense of people like her great-grandfather, Miles Carter. Lena had always believed in the power of knowledge, but she now realized that knowledge was only the beginning. What she had uncovered wasn't just history, it was the foundation of an ongoing injustice that had to be addressed. The night after her discovery, she sat alone in the library, her mind racing with the enormity of what she had found. Julian had been quiet during dinner, sensing her preoccupation, but he hadn't pressed her for details. He knew that Lena was a woman of purpose, and whatever she had uncovered was far more important than the small talk they usually shared. As the last rays of sunlight slipped away, the moonlight cast long shadows across the room. Lena sat in the silence, a heavy weight pressing on her chest. What should she do next? She had come to Harrison Ridge seeking peace, seeking freedom from a past that had held her captive for too long. But now she could no longer remain passive. She had a responsibility not only to herself, but to her ancestors, to the people who had been wronged by the town's founders. The land was hers by birthright, and she would not allow the lies of the past to persist. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Lena stood up, smoothing her dress and gathering the papers she had scattered across the table. She knew who it was before the door even opened. "Miss Carter," Julian said softly, stepping into the room. "I didn't want to intrude, but I thought you might want some company." Lena smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you, Julian. I appreciate it." Julian closed the door behind him, his eyes scanning the room. He could see the tension in her posture, the way her hands clenched around the edges of the papers, as if they were the only thing anchoring her to this world. "You've been busy," he remarked, his voice low, but filled with understanding. "I can see that you've uncovered something important." Lena nodded her fingers, tracing the edges of the documents. I've uncovered more than just history. I've uncovered the truth. And now I have to do something about it. Julian's gaze sharpened. What are you planning? Lena hesitated. She had been turning the idea over in her mind for hours, weighing the risks and the consequences, but she couldn't back down. This was her moment. I'm going to expose what happened, she said, her voice steady. I'm going to make sure that everyone in this town knows the truth about how their wealth and power were built on the backs of people like my great-grandfather. Julian's face softened, a hint of admiration in his eyes. You know that could cause a great deal of trouble? Lena met his gaze, her expression unwavering. I know, but I can't live with the knowledge of what was done and not take action. The people who stole this land need to face the truth. It's the only way to bring real justice to this town. There was a long silence as Julian processed her words. Lena could see the weight of his thoughts reflected in his eyes. He knew what kind of man Nathan Turner was, and he knew the resistance that Lena would face from the town's power structure, but he also knew Lena knew her strength, her resilience. If you're determined to do this, Julian said, his voice quiet but resolute, I'll stand by you. I'll help you however I can. Lena felt a flicker of gratitude toward him. She had come to Harrison Ridge as a stranger, someone seeking refuge. But in Julian she had found more than an ally. She had found someone who understood the stakes and was willing to fight alongside her. Thank you, Lena said, her voice filled with sincerity. I don't know how far this will go, but I can't do it alone. Julian nodded, his expression firm. You won't be alone. We'll do this together. The following days were a whirlwind. Lena and Julian worked together to strategize how best to approach the townspeople, knowing that any attempt to expose the truth would be met with resistance. But Lena was determined. She knew the risks, but she also knew that the truth had the power to change everything. They began by meeting with key figures in the town, people who were not tied to the founding families, people who might be willing to listen, but the reaction they received was mixed. Some were sympathetic, others fearful of the consequences that such revelations could bring. The founding families had deep roots in Harrison Ridge, and the idea of tearing down the foundation they had built was unthinkable to many. But as Lena shared the evidence with more people, the whispers of her discovery began to spread. The truth was taking root in the minds of the townspeople, and with it came a sense of unease. It wasn't long before Nathan Turner caught wind of the growing unrest. One afternoon, Lena received a visit. Nathan stood at the door, his face tight with anger, his eyes full of something darker, resentment perhaps, or fear. You're making a mistake, Miss Carter, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You don't know what you're up against. The people here will never accept what you're trying to do. You'll ruin everything. Lena stood tall, unflinching in the face of his anger. What I'm doing is right, Mr. Turner. The truth can't be hidden anymore. Nathan took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. You think the truth will save you? You're out of your depth? Lena didn't flinch. I'm not the one who's out of my depth. You are. This land doesn't belong to you or your family. It never did, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it. Nathan's expression darkened. You'll regret this. Lena watched him turn and walk away, but this time she felt no fear. The truth had a way of breaking through even the strongest walls. And in this small town, the walls were about to come down. The morning after Nathan Turner's threatening visit, Lena woke early, the pale light of dawn creeping through the heavy curtains of her room. The manor was quiet, the soft sounds of the outside world, birds calling, the breeze rustling the leaves, offering a strange contrast to the turmoil that churned inside her. Lena stood by the window looking out at the vast grounds of Fairchild Manor, her mind racing. She had made up her mind there was no turning back now. The documents she had uncovered the truth about her great-grandfather's stolen land. It all pointed to one undeniable fact. Harrison Ridge had been built on a lie, and she couldn't let that lie continue. She could feel the weight of the responsibility pressing on her shoulders. It wasn't just about her and her family anymore. It was about the future of the town, the people who had lived in the shadow of its hidden history, and the possibility of a new beginning for everyone. But to make that change, she needed more than just the truth. She needed allies, people who would stand with her and support her, even if it meant defying everything they had ever known. Lena had already spoken with several town residents, all of whom were sympathetic to her cause. But each conversation left her with the same nagging feeling. Fear of what would happen if the truth came out. Fear of the backlash from the established families who had built their wealth on the very land Lena's great-grandfather had been robbed of. But there was no turning back. Lena had made a promise to herself and to her ancestors, and now she had to see it through. The next afternoon, Julian drove her into Harrison Ridge in his carriage at the same town she had arrived in just days earlier. Only now it felt different. The streets seemed quieter, the eyes of the townspeople more watchful, as though they were waiting for something to happen. The two of them had devised a plan. The town hall meeting, which was set for the following week, would be the perfect opportunity to reveal the truth to everyone. Lena would present her evidence, and with Julian's support, she hoped to make the townspeople understand the depth of the injustice that had been done to her family and to the town as a whole. But even as she made plans, doubt lingered. Would they listen, or would they turn on her, as they had with her great-grandfather all those years ago? Julian pulled the carriage to a stop in front of the small, nondescript building that housed Harrison Ridge's town hall. As Lena stepped out, she felt her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the moment that could change everything. They were here to face the old guard, the families who had held power for generations. As they made their way to the door, Lena couldn't help but notice the curious looks of the townspeople, their whispers floating on the wind. Word had gotten out about Lena's discovery, and she could feel the tension in the air. Some people had started to talk openly about the truth about how Lena's great-grandfather had been wronged about the stolen land. But with the truth came fear, and fear often led to division. Inside, the town hall was already filling up. The room, though modest in size, was charged with energy. People were murmuring amongst themselves, their faces a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. Lena stood at the back, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, trying to calm the storm of thoughts in her head. Julian stood beside her, a steady presence, offering silent support. As the room filled, Lena took her seat, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew what was at stake, and the weight of it pressed down on her like a stone. She glanced around the room, her gaze briefly meeting Nathan Turner, who was sitting near the front. His face was tight, his jaw clenched, and for a moment their eyes locked. She could feel the tension between them. The battle lines had been drawn. The meeting began with the usual pleasantries. Mayor Walter Richardson called the room to order, his voice projecting authority as he began talking about the town's usual business taxes, local policies, and other mundane matters. But it didn't take long for the murmurs in the room to turn into restless whispers. It seemed everyone was waiting for Lena to speak. Finally, Julian rose from his seat, his voice commanding attention as he stood and addressed the room. Ladies and gentlemen, Julian began, his gaze sweeping over the gathered townspeople. I trust you're all aware of the issue that has brought us here today. Lena Carter, the great-granddaughter of Miles Carter, has uncovered something that affects all of us. It's not just her history, it's all of ours. Lena felt a wave of gratitude for Julian's unwavering support. His voice carried weight, and his words seemed to set the stage for what was to come. She stood, her hands trembling slightly as she made her way to the front of the room. She could feel the eyes of every person in the room on her, their gazes sharp and piercing, as though they were judging her every move. Thank you, Mr. Fairchild, Lena said, her voice steady, despite the nerves that fluttered in her stomach. What I'm about to share isn't just a personal story. It's a story about all of us, the land we live on, the history we're a part of, and the injustice that has been buried for too long. She paused, her eyes scanning the room, locking on familiar faces, some curious, others skeptical. I've uncovered documents that prove my great-grandfather was promised land when he was freed from slavery. Lena continued, her voice rising with conviction. Land that was taken from him, stolen by the founding families of this town, including Mr. Turner's ancestors. A murmur rippled through the room. Lena could see the shock in people's eyes, the disbelief. She knew that what she was saying was hard to believe. But it was the truth. I have the deed, Lena said, holding up the fragile document, its edges worn, but the text clear. This deed proves that Miles Carter was the rightful owner of land in Harrison Ridge, but that land was taken by deceit, by manipulation. Nathan Turner's face went pale, his fingers tightening around the armrest of his chair. He stood abruptly, his voice sharp as he addressed the room. This is absurd, he shouted. These are nothing but old papers. You can't believe this woman. She's just trying to cause trouble. But Lena didn't flinch. She had expected this. She had expected Nathan to fight back to try and discredit her. But this time it wouldn't work, sir. Turner Lena said, her voice unwavering. The truth has a way of coming to light no matter how much we try to bury it. And today that truth will be heard. The room fell silent as Lena presented the evidence. Detailed accounts, land records, and testimonies from those who had witnessed the injustices. Slowly the truth began to sink in, and the murmurs of disbelief turned to uneasy silence. As Lena finished, she glanced over at Julian, who stood by her side offering his quiet support. This was just the beginning, but Lena knew that this was the moment that would change everything. The battle for Harrison Ridge had only just begun. The days following Nathan's visit were filled with tension, as if the very air in Harrison Ridge had thickened with uncertainty. Lena knew the town was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to break. Her words at the town hall had set something in motion. But the real challenge now was ensuring that the truth she had uncovered would be more than just whispers. It had to become undeniable. With Julian's help, Lena had scheduled a meeting with the most influential members of the town, those who were not directly involved with the founding families, but whose voices could sway the community. She had carefully planned every word, every gesture, knowing that the outcome of this meeting would determine whether her cause would stand a chance or crumble under the weight of fear and tradition. The evening before the meeting, Lena sat by the fire in the manor's sitting room, her fingers tracing the edges of the documents she had collected. She had read them over and over again, memorizing every detail. There was no room for error. This wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had been wronged by the powerful families who had controlled the town for generations. Julian entered the room quietly, a glass of wine in his hand. "You've been at this for hours," he said, gently sitting beside her. "You don't need to do it alone, you know." Lena looked up, her expression softening slightly. She had grown fond of Julian, not just for his support, but for the way he challenged her to think bigger. He never treated her as a fragile woman who needed protection. Instead, he saw her as a force to be reckoned with, just as capable of leading as anyone else in the room. "I know, Julian," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But this is something I have to do. I can't let this go. I can't walk away." Julian nodded, setting the glass down on the table. "I understand, but don't forget that you have people who will stand by you, including me. This is about more than just justice for your family. It's about making sure the town doesn't continue to live in the shadows of its past." Lena's heart swelled with gratitude, but there was no time for sentiment now. Tomorrow would be the moment of reckoning. The next day, Lena, Julian, and a few trusted supporters made their way to the town hall. The weather was overcast and the air was thick with the anticipation that had gripped the town for days. As they approached the building, Lena could see the faces of the townspeople peering out from behind curtains and doorways, their eyes full of curiosity and unease. The meeting room was already filling up when they arrived. People were murmuring among themselves, casting wary glances at Lena as she entered. The town's power brokers were seated near the front, their faces stern, prepared for a confrontation they could feel coming, though they couldn't yet understand the full scope of what Lena was about to reveal. The atmosphere in the room was charged with a tension that felt almost suffocating. Lena took a deep breath and walked confidently to the front. The room fell silent as she took her place at the head of the table, her gaze steady, her expression calm. She had come this far and there was no turning back. "Thank you all for gathering today," Lena began, her voice clear and authoritative. "I know this may be uncomfortable for some of you, but we cannot move forward as a town if we do not confront the truth. The truth about the land we live on, the land that has made us all who we are." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in, and then continued. "Last week I shared with you the documents that prove my great-grandfather Miles Carter was promised land when he was freed. The land that was rightfully his, but it was stolen from him, and the families who founded this town, including the Turners and the Fairchilds, were complicit in that theft." There was an audible gasp in the room, but Lena didn't falter. She had expected the reaction. She had expected the disbelief, the defensiveness, the questions. It was all part of the process. "Today," she said, her voice growing stronger, "I'm here not just to tell you about the theft of my family's land, but to explain what it means for all of us. Because this isn't just about the Carter family. It's about the foundation of Harrison Ridge. The wealth and power that we have built our town on comes from stolen land, and the consequences of that injustice affect us all. Lena looked around the room, her eyes locking with those of the key figures who had helped shape the town, people who had a stake in the past, but who could also shape the future. The question I'm asking you today, she continued, is this: what are we willing to do with the truth once we know it? There was a long pause, broken only by the shuffle of chairs and the murmur of voices. Nathan Turner's face had gone ashen, his fists clenched at his sides, but it was Judge Thornton who spoke first. Miss Carter, the judge began, his voice trembling slightly. These are serious accusations. You can't just come into this town and make claims without consequences. The families you are accusing have been pillars of this community for generations. They've worked hard to build this town. What you're suggesting would destroy everything. Lena's heart skipped a beat, but she stood tall, refusing to be intimidated. I'm not suggesting anything, Judge Thornton, she replied evenly. I'm stating facts. I have the documents, the evidence. And if we do not correct the wrongs of the past, how can we look ourselves in the mirror and call ourselves just? How can we build a better future if we continue to hide the truth? Her words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment the room was silent. Then a soft voice spoke from the back of the room. I agree with Miss Carter, said Reverend Miller, his voice steady. We cannot move forward while ignoring the injustices of the past. We must face the truth, no matter how painful it may be. Lena turned toward the Reverend, her eyes grateful. Slowly, one by one, others began to speak up, expressing their support for the truth and for a new beginning. It wasn't an easy victory. There were still many who resisted, who clung to the status quo, but the tide was slowly turning. The town was beginning to listen. Nathan Turner, his face filled with fury, stood up abruptly. This isn't over, he spat. You think you can come here and tear down everything my family has worked for? You've made a mistake, Miss Carter, and you'll regret it. But Lena, her resolve stronger than ever, simply stood her ground. Maybe I will regret it, she said calmly, but I'd rather regret doing the right thing than live with the regret of doing nothing. The days after the town hall meeting felt like the calm before a storm, though Lena had made her case clear. The true consequences of her actions had yet to unfold. Nathan Turner's threats echoed in her mind, but she refused to let fear sway her determination. The truth had been exposed, and now there was no turning back. But the town was divided. Some, like Reverend Miller and a few other respected figures, had rallied behind her. They saw the injustice in the past and believed that Harrison Ridge could not move forward without confronting it. Others, however, including many of the wealthier landowners and longtime families, clung to the idea that the past should remain buried, that reopening old wounds would only tear the town apart. Lena knew that the coming days would be difficult. The town's rejection of her cause wasn't just a matter of principle. It was a fight over their very identities, over the foundations that had made Harrison Ridge what it was. If the land was returned to her family, it would mean upending the power structure. That kind of change threatened everything they had built. As Lena walked through the manor's gardens, she could feel the weight of what was at stake pressing down on her. The wind rustled the trees, and the scent of the roses that Julian's late mother had planted years ago filled the air. For a moment, she allowed herself to pause, to breathe, and to remind herself why she was here. She had come to Harrison Ridge to reclaim what was rightfully hers, but the battle was now about much more than land. It was about the future of the town and the dignity of her ancestors. The next evening, Lena sat in the grand dining room of Fairchild Manor. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light across the room. Julian sat across from her, his expression as serious as ever. The silence between them felt heavy with unspoken words. You've been quiet today, Lena remarked, breaking the silence. Is something on your mind? Julian set down his wine glass and leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. It's just, I'm concerned about the next steps. You're right, Lena. The town is divided, and the opposition isn't going to back down so easily. Nathan Turner isn't the only one who's going to fight this. There are others who will do anything to protect the way things have been. Lena nodded. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was the only road she could take. I've made my decision, she said, her voice steady. I won't let this town live in the shadow of its past anymore. If I have to go up against every powerful family in this town, I will. Julian watched her with a mixture of admiration and concern. I know you will, but sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight alone. Lena met his gaze, her heart swelling with determination. I'm not alone, she replied quietly. You've been with me from the start, and I've got other people too. People who see the truth. He smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. You're right, but be careful, Lena. The fight you're facing isn't just about justice. It's about power. And power can change people in ways you don't expect. Lena looked out the window, watching the last light of day fade into the horizon. She understood what he meant. Power had shaped this town for generations, and it wouldn't give up without a fight. But she had something more powerful on her side, the truth. The next morning, Lena and Julian met with a few of their key supporters, Reverend Miller, Martha Webb, and Thomas Brooks, a local farmer who had seen firsthand the effects of the town's inequality. They gathered in the library, surrounded by the old books that seemed to hold the secrets of the town's history. Lena had spent the last few days preparing for the next big step, gathering evidence, meeting with other members of the community, and organizing her supporters. We need to make sure the town understands that this isn't just about me. Lena began standing at the head of the table. It's about everyone. If we can't convince them that they're complicit in this injustice, we'll lose. We need to show them that this is about building a future for everyone, not just for the few. Reverend Miller nodded thoughtfully. You're right, Miss Carter, we need to approach this carefully. There are people in this town who've lived their whole lives believing that this land belongs to them. They need to see how they benefited from a system built on inequality. Exactly, Lena replied, turning to face Thomas, who had been sitting quietly in the corner. Thomas, you know the land better than anyone. What can you tell us about the impact this land has had on the town's economy? How have these families maintained control for so long? Thomas stood, his weathered face showing the burden of years of hard labor. The land has been the lifeblood of Harrison Ridge. The Turners, the Fairchilds, hell, they've controlled the wealth, the businesses, the jobs. For generations, they've kept the rest of us in check, tied to the land with little to no chance of breaking free. Lena felt the weight of his words. For the people of Harrison Ridge, land wasn't just something they worked. It was something that had been taken from them, something that had shaped their lives in ways they could never fully understand until it was too late. We need to show them that returning the land isn't about destroying their livelihoods. Lena said, her voice strong. It's about creating a fair system, a system where the people who've been oppressed can finally have a stake in the town's future. Martha Webb, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. And we need to make sure that the community knows we're not trying to destroy the town. We want to rebuild it. This is a chance for people to come together and finally make things right. Lena smiled at her supporters. Exactly. We can't just take the land back without a plan. We'll create a community fund, invest in education and housing for the less fortunate. We'll give people a real chance to rise up, not just the ones who've been on top for centuries. The plan began to take shape over the next few days. Lena and her team worked tirelessly, gathering more support and preparing for the town meeting that would decide the future of Harrison Ridge. They crafted speeches, made calls, and arranged meetings with local business owners, trying to show them that the town's future didn't have to be built on the backs of the oppressed. It could be a place where everyone could prosper, but only if they were willing to acknowledge the wrongs of the past. But as the meeting approached, Nathan Turner began to rally his allies. The old guard wasn't going to go down without a fight. Lena knew that this was the moment that would determine everything. The town would either choose to face the truth or continue living in the lie that had defined their history. The night before the town meeting, the air in Harrison Ridge felt charged with an electric energy. Every whisper, every glance seemed to carry the weight of history. It was as if the entire town had been holding its breath, waiting for something to give. Lena had done everything she could to prepare, gathering evidence, meeting with her supporters, and crafting a vision for the future. Now it all came down to this moment. She sat in the library of Fairchild Manor, the old wooden desk in front of her, covered with documents, maps, and notes. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, but Lena felt no warmth from it. Her mind was elsewhere, focused on the meeting that would take place the following day. Are you ready for this? Julian asked, his voice breaking the silence as he entered the room. His face, always composed, now showed a flicker of concern. He knew how much was at stake for Lena and for the town. Lena took a deep breath, pushing the papers aside as she looked up at him. "I don't think anyone can be ready for something like this," she said, her voice calm but filled with a quiet intensity. "But I've come too far to turn back now." Julian moved to stand beside her, his gaze softening. "You've made a lot of people think whether they like it or not. Tomorrow won't be easy, but I know you're ready. You've already shown them the truth." Lena nodded, her eyes scanning the room as she reflected on how far she had come since her arrival in Harrison Ridge. The woman who had first stepped off that train, unsure of what to expect, was now someone with a clear vision, a woman willing to fight for justice, no matter the cost. "I just wish I could be sure they'll listen tomorrow," she said, her tone tinged with uncertainty. "They're so set in their ways, so tied to their past." Julian placed a hand on her shoulder. "Change never comes easily, Lena, but what you're doing, it matters. Whether they understand it now or not, you're planting the seed for a better future." She smiled faintly, appreciating his unwavering support. "I hope so. But tomorrow it's not just about making them listen. It's about making them act." The morning of the meeting. Harrison Ridge Town Hall was already crowded by the time Lena and Julian arrived. The room was filled with the usual murmurs of the town's residents. Many of them had come to witness the unfolding drama, some out of curiosity, others out of fear. The divide between the two factions had never been so clear. On one side, the supporters of Lena's cause, standing firm in their belief in justice and equality. On the other, the old guard Nathan Turner and his allies, waiting to defend what they considered their rightful control. Lena stepped into the room, her heart pounding but her gaze steady. She could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on her as she made her way to the front, Julian by her side. The moment the doors had closed behind them, the room fell silent. It was as if time itself had stopped. The mayor, Walter Richardson, took his place at the front of the room, looking between the two groups. His face was drawn tired, as though he knew what was coming, but wasn't prepared for the storm that was about to break. "We're gathered here today." The mayor began, his voice steady, but there was a tension in the air. "To discuss the claims made by Miss Lena Carter regarding the land dispute involving her great-grandfather, Miles Carter." Lena rose to her feet as the mayor nodded to her. She felt the eyes of the room on her, some skeptical, some supportive, but all watching closely. "I won't stand here and tell you what I think you want to hear." Lena began, her voice strong, steady. "What I'm here to do is to tell you the truth that has been hidden for far too long, the truth that has caused pain and injustice for generations." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. The room was still. Even Nathan Turner, who sat at the front with his arms crossed tightly, looked uneasy. "My great-grandfather, Miles Carter, was promised land when he was freed from slavery. A promise that was broken, a promise that was stolen from him and from my family. And now I'm here to take what is rightfully ours, but not just for us. For the people who have been oppressed, who have been silenced for so long." There was a ripple of murmurs through the crowd. Some faces remained hard and skeptical, but Lena could see the glimmers of realization in others, people who had never thought about the town's past in this way. Before Lena walked forward, holding up the legal documents once more. "These documents show the truth. My great-grandfather's land was stolen by deceit, by force. The families that founded this town, families like the Turners and the Fairchilds, profited from that injustice. And that's the truth that we have to face today." Nathan Turner stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "This is madness. You're trying to tear this town apart, Lena. You're threatening everything we've built." Lena didn't flinch. "What you've built was built on lies, Mr. Turner, on the backs of people like my great-grandfather, and that's not something we can just ignore anymore." There was a tense silence. For a moment it seemed as though the room was on the verge of breaking into chaos, but Lena held her ground. She knew this was her moment. If she could get the town to understand, if she could make them see that they had a choice, then they could build something better together. After several hours of heated discussion, the room grew quiet again. There had been arguments, accusations, and impassioned speeches on both sides, but in the end it came down to the people. The town could no longer pretend that the past hadn't happened. They could no longer turn a blind eye to the injustice that had defined them for so long. As the mayor called for a vote, Lena held her breath. She knew that the tide was turning, but it wasn't over yet. The vote was taken and the results were clear. The majority of the town had voted in favor of Lena's proposal to return the land to her family. The support was overwhelming. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. It was a declaration that Harrison Ridge could no longer live in the shadow of its past. As Lena stepped outside the town hall, Julian by her side, the weight of what had just happened began to settle over her. She could hear the townspeople talking in hushed tones, but there was a sense of relief in the air. The battle wasn't over, but today Lena had won a crucial victory. "I never thought I'd see the day," Julian said quietly, his voice full of respect. "You did it, Lena." Lena looked at him, a small smile forming on her lips. "We did it, Julian." Together. The weeks that followed the town hall meeting felt like a whirlwind. The decision to return the land to Lena's family had sent ripples through Harrison Ridge, shaking the very foundations of the town. For the first time in its history, the town was forced to confront its past. Not just the land dispute, but the deep-seated inequalities that had existed for generations. Lena had known that the battle was far from over, but she felt a sense of relief when she saw the change beginning to take shape. The vote was a crucial step, but the real work was just beginning. The town would have to reckon with its history and rebuild its future. And Lena knew that it wouldn't be easy. There were still those who resisted the change, those who believed that the status quo was the only way forward. But Lena had always known that change wasn't just about winning. It was about ensuring that the change had meaning, that it would create a future that everyone could share. It was late one afternoon when Lena sat down with Julian, staring out the window of Fairchild Manor. The estate had felt different these past few weeks. It was as though the air had shifted, a weight lifted, but also a sense of anticipation hanging over the horizon. "Do you ever wonder if we've made the right decision?" Lena asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Julian, who had been busy working on town records, paused and looked at her. He had always been someone who could balance optimism with realism, and his gaze was filled with a steady calm. "Every decision we've made has been a step toward something better." "Lena," he said, his tone even but firm, "change is never easy. But what you've done is nothing short of revolutionary. The people who've resisted will either come around or they'll fall behind. You've set this town on a new path, and nothing can take that away." Lena smiled faintly, but her mind was still restless. "I just wish it were simpler. I wish people could see it like we do." "They will in time," Julian said, his eyes softening. "This isn't just about land or laws. It's about dignity, about people being able to stand tall in their own lives. What you've started will change more than just this town. It'll inspire others. It already is." Lena nodded but couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach. The opposition wasn't just going to disappear. Nathan Turner and his allies might have lost the vote, but they still had influence power that would be hard to break. She knew that if Harrison Ridge was truly going to change, it needed more than just a vote. It needed action. It needed leadership. The next day, Lena called a meeting at Fairchild Manor with her core group of supporters, Reverend Miller, Martha Webb, and Thomas Brooks. She needed to plan what came next, how they would begin the process of restoring the land to her family, and ensuring that the town's future was built on fairness, equality, and opportunity for all. The group gathered in the sitting room, the fire crackling in the hearth, the heavy wooden table before them filled with papers, maps, and blueprints for the new town plans. Everyone had brought their ideas, their hopes, and their concerns. Lena stood at the front of the room, the weight of leadership settling on her shoulders once more. "We've won the first battle, but this town's future is still in our hands. We can't afford to let the old guard dictate the future of this town anymore. We need to start making real changes. The land that's been returned to my family is only the beginning." Reverend Miller nodded thoughtfully. "I've been speaking with the townsfolk, those who are struggling. Many of them don't just need land. They need homes, education, a future. They need a system that works for everyone, not just the few who've always had power." Martha added, "We need to start with the children. Education is the key to breaking this cycle of poverty." We can't give them the land without giving them the tools to make the most of it. We need to build schools, invest in training programs, and give them opportunities to thrive. Lena smiled, grateful for their insight. Exactly. We can't just restore what was taken. We need to rebuild what was broken, and we need to start with the people who've been ignored for far too long. This isn't just about fairness. It's about creating a town that works for everyone. Thomas leaned forward, his expression serious. What about the businesses? We need to ensure that the local economy is not only supported by the old landowners, but by everyone. I've spoken to a few local farmers who are willing to sell their crops. But we'll need to create a system that allows new businesses to thrive too. Lena took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the responsibility pressing down on her again. We'll start small, but we'll build. First, we'll focus on making sure the families who've been displaced get the support they need. We'll work with local banks to offer loans for housing and start developing a community fund for the people who've been most affected by the land grab. Reverend Miller spoke up again. And we'll need to bring the community together. The past is hard to let go of, and many will resist the change. But we can't let that stop us. We must find ways to bring everyone to the table. Lena nodded, her resolve firming. We'll do this together. No one gets left behind. We'll restore the land, build homes, create schools, and give everyone the opportunity to succeed. But more than that, we'll make sure that Harrison Ridge becomes a place where people can live and thrive without fear or injustice. The following months were filled with work, compromise, and setbacks. The old guard, led by Nathan Turner, didn't give up easily. There were legal battles, protests, and arguments over the specifics of the new plans. But Lena, Julian, and their supporters remained unwavering. The fight wasn't over, but each small victory was a step closer to the town they had all dreamed of. The first school was built on the land that had once belonged to Lena's great-grandfather. It was a modest building, but it was a start. Local farmers who had once been exploited were now able to sell their produce at fair prices thanks to new trade agreements set up by Lena and her supporters. The first homes were built, and the town began to feel the pulse of a new life, a new future. And as Lena stood in front of the new school one bright morning, watching children run in and out, their faces full of hope, she knew that the fight was worth it. They hadn't just reclaimed land, they had reclaimed their dignity, their future. It had been 6 months since the vote that had changed everything for Harrison Ridge. The town, once shackled by its history, had begun to slowly transform. The land had been returned. New homes were being built, and the first school had opened its doors. Yet despite all the progress, the road ahead was still fraught with obstacles. Lena sat in the office she had set up in a modest building near the town center, the sunlight pouring through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. She'd spent most of the morning going over financial reports, checking the status of the community fund, and making sure that the development projects were on track. Her life had changed dramatically since the day she arrived in Harrison Ridge, and every day she felt the weight of leadership pressing down on her. The battle for justice was no longer just a fight for her family's land. It was a fight to reshape the future of the town itself. She looked over at Julian, who had joined her in these efforts, becoming an invaluable ally in the community's transformation. He stood at the window looking out at the town square, his expression thoughtful. "The school's doing well," Julian remarked, his voice breaking the silence. "The first group of students has started learning about local history, about their place in this town. It's a small thing, but it's something." Lena smiled faintly, feeling a sense of pride, but also the pressure of what still lay ahead. It's more than a small thing. They're the future. This new generation will have a chance to shape things differently, to live in a world where they're not bound by the mistakes of the past. Her mind drifted back to the moments after the vote, when the community's future seemed uncertain. She'd known that winning the land back wasn't enough. It was just the beginning of a much longer journey. People had been fearful of what the changes would mean. The old guard had fought tooth and nail to maintain control. But as the months passed, she had begun to see the small victories that signaled real change. One of the most significant challenges Lena faced was not just transforming the town, but keeping the momentum going. The opposition, though diminished, was still present. Nathan Turner had been forced to relinquish control of the land, but he hadn't gone quietly. His family's wealth and influence in Harrison Ridge meant they still had powerful allies, and many of the old systems of power were still deeply entrenched. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Lena and Julian walked together through the newly established town square. The town was beginning to feel different, less like the divided place it had been, and more like a community with a shared vision. Children ran past them, laughing and playing their carefree joy, a testament to the future Lena had fought for. I spoke with some of the farmers today. Julian said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of the conversation. They're still wary. They don't fully trust that this new system will work long term. Lena sighed, pausing to watch the children playing in the distance. I can't blame them. I don't trust it all the way either. We've only just begun to scratch the surface of real change, but we have to keep moving forward. We have to keep showing them that this isn't about tearing things down, it's about rebuilding. Julian nodded, a knowing look in his eyes. It's a long road ahead, but you've already shown them that it's possible to change, and that's something they can't take away. Lena turned to him, her face lit by the soft glow of the evening light. We've built something here, Julian, but it's still fragile. People have lived their whole lives in fear of change. The fear of losing what they have always known is hard to overcome. I know, Julian replied, but you've started the process. Now it's about making sure the change sticks, showing them that the future is bigger than the past. As the days turned into weeks, Lena found herself grappling with the complex realities of leadership. Harrison Ridge was slowly becoming the town she had always hoped for, but it wasn't without its challenges. The tension between the old families and the new was palpable, but Lena also knew that time would be the key. The children in the new school, the young farmers learning how to grow crops sustainably, the families who had finally been given the chance to own their land. They were the future. Lena's focus shifted to something more than land development. She had to ensure that the town had a sustainable economy, one that didn't rely on old ways of doing things. She worked tirelessly with local leaders and businesses to establish trade routes, encourage new industries, and build relationships with neighboring towns. The world outside Harrison Ridge was changing, and Lena knew that they had to change with it. The tension between the old and new still simmered beneath the surface. Nathan Turner had been quiet for a while, but his influence was still felt. He had retreated from the public eye, but Lena knew that wasn't the end of him. He wouldn't go down easily. However, Lena had learned over the months that power didn't always come from wealth or history. It came from the will of the people. And as long as she had their support, she could keep fighting for what was right. A few months later, as Lena stood at the edge of the newly established community garden, looking out over the land that had once belonged to her great-grandfather, she felt a deep sense of peace. The garden was thriving, a symbol of the town's resilience, a place where old wounds were slowly being healed and new growth was taking root. The community had come together to turn what had once been a symbol of injustice into a beacon of hope. Lena smiled softly, watching as children worked alongside the farmers, learning to tend the land that had once been stolen. They were learning more than how to grow crops. They were learning how to build a future, just as she had. We've come a long way, haven't we? Julian said, stepping up beside her. Lena turned to him, a quiet pride in her eyes. We have, but the real work is still ahead of us. This town has a chance now. We all do. It's not just about the land, it's about what we do with it. She paused for a moment, her thoughts drifting to the future, one that had only just begun. This is just the beginning, Julian. We've built something good, but we have to keep building. We can't stop now. Julian nodded, his expression resolute. Together, Lena smiled, her heart swelling with the realization that she wasn't alone in this. She had come to Harrison Ridge looking for a new beginning, and now she was part of something far bigger than she could have imagined. And as the sun set over the land that had once been her family's, now returned and reimagined, Lena knew that the legacy of change she had started would continue to grow, just like the town itself.